Empires don't always fall to armies. Sometimes they fall to accountants.
Picture this, the most powerful empire in the Middle East, a superpower that had kept Europe trembling for centuries, slowly suffocated, not by soldiers, not by cannons, not by invasions, but by compound interest. This is the story of the world's first true debt trap in the modern era, and it contains a warning that is more relevant today than it has ever been.
You do not need to invade a country to own it. You simply need to hold its mortgage.
In the middle of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire still looked like a titan from the outside. It stretched from the mountains of the Balkans all the way across Anatolia, south through the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, and across the deserts of North Africa. The Sultan in Istanbul sat at the crossroads of the civilized world. But beneath that surface of imperial grandeur, the foundations were quietly rotting away.
While Britain and France were racing through the Industrial Revolution, building steam engines, factories, and railways, the Ottoman economy was frozen in a medieval past. It was a land of peasants and craftsmen trying to compete in a world that had moved on without them. The treasury was chronically empty. The tax system was archaic, riddled with corruption, with local officials pocketing half the revenue before it ever reached the capital.
For centuries, sultans had solved these cash problems through currency debasement or seizing the wealth of powerful officials. But those medieval tricks were no longer enough. The empire desperately needed capital to survive, and it needed it fast.
For generations, Ottoman rulers had resisted the temptation to borrow from Western banks. There was a deep cultural resistance to the concept of usury, and a real political fear of becoming dependent on the Christian powers of Europe. But in 1853, that dam broke. Russia invaded Ottoman territory, sparking the Crimean War. Britain and France entered the fight to stop Russian expansion, and with their armies came their bankers.
The war was draining the Ottoman treasury at an unsustainable rate. Soldiers had to be paid, cannons had to be cast, ships had to be provisioned. Sultan Abdul-Majid was desperate, and so in 1854 the Ottoman Empire did something it had never done before. It signed its first foreign loan agreement with a syndicate of British and French bankers.
The terms were predatory from the very first day. For every £100 of debt the Sultan signed for, only £80 actually arrived in Istanbul. The bank kept the difference as commission, but the Sultan still owed interest on the full 100. This was the original sin. They were borrowing less than they owed, at interest rates that were punishingly high. And yet, when that first wave of cash arrived, it felt miraculous. The army was paid, the crisis eased.
The Russians were eventually defeated, and the Sultan discovered what he believed was a magic trick. Sign a piece of paper in London and gold appears at your doorstep.
The Ottoman elite had tasted easy credit and were instantly addicted. They looked at the grand boulevards of Paris and the marble opera houses of London and felt a burning sense of inferiority. Rather than investing borrowed funds into factories, irrigation, or education, they invested in appearances. The clearest example of this was the Dolmabahce Palace, a staggering monument to vanity built on the shores of the Bosporus. 14 tons of gold leaf.
The largest Bohemian crystal chandelier in the world. Baccarat crystal staircases. Silk carpets, Italian marble on every wall, a breathtakingly beautiful building, and an absolute tombstone for the empire's finances.
It cost 5 million Ottoman gold lira,
roughly a quarter of the entire annual tax revenue of the empire, all of it borrowed. While the peasants of Anatolia were scratching at the dry earth with wooden plows, the Sultan was importing crystal from Bohemia to decorate a house he could not afford.
Loan followed loan. 1855, 1858, 1860. The bankers in London and Paris were delighted to keep lending. They were making fortunes on commissions and interest rates, and they assumed that the geopolitical importance of the empire meant it would never truly be allowed to collapse. By the 1860s, the Ottoman financial situation had become a classic Ponzi scheme.
The empire was not generating enough revenue to cover the interest on its old debts, so it was borrowing new money simply to pay the old bills. By 1870, over 50% of every coin collected from a Greek fisherman, a Syrian farmer, or an Anatolian shepherd was leaving the country immediately, traveling to the pockets of bondholders in London and Paris. Nothing was left for schools, roads, or an army.
Then, in 1873, a financial panic swept across the globe, triggering what historians call the Long Depression. European banks stopped lending overnight, and at the same moment, a catastrophic drought struck the heartland of Anatolia. Crops failed, livestock died, the tax base of the empire was starving, revenue collapsed, but the debt payments remained fixed.
In October 1875, the Grand Vizier looked at the ledgers and accepted the truth. The empire was bankrupt. The government announced it would cut debt payments in half, issuing paper IOUs for the remainder. In the polite language of diplomacy, this was a moratorium. In the brutal language of finance, it was a default.
European newspapers exploded with fury. Middle-class investors who had bought Ottoman bonds for the high yields watched their savings evaporate. The diplomatic protection Britain and France had offered the Ottomans against Russia vanished overnight. Sensing weakness, Russia declared war in 1877. The Ottoman army fought with courage but was unpaid, undersupplied, and demoralized. Russian forces marched to the very outskirts of Istanbul.
The peace treaty that followed was humiliating, stripping away vast territories and imposing a war indemnity of over 800 million francs on top of the existing mountain of debt. The empire was insolvent, defenseless, and stripped of dignity.
But the British and French had no interest in a messy territorial conquest. Governing people is expensive. What they wanted was something far more elegant. They wanted the cash flow.
In December 1881, European bankers arrived in Istanbul carrying briefcases instead of swords. The agreement they dictated was called the Decree of Muharrem, and it created one of the most remarkable institutions in the history of imperialism, the Ottoman Public Debt Administration.
This was not a government body. It was a corporation run by a board of directors representing the banks of Britain, France, Germany, Italy, and Austria. It headquartered itself in a fortress-like building in Istanbul that towered over the city as a physical reminder of who was actually in charge. The empire's most valuable sources of revenue were handed directly to this foreign corporation.
Taxes on silk, salt, tobacco, fish, spirits, and all legal documents were transferred out of Ottoman hands entirely. The OPDA built its own bureaucracy of over 5,000 armed tax collectors who answered not to the Sultan but to European bankers. They spread across the empire from Macedonia to Syria, extracting wealth from the people of a nation that no longer fully controlled its own finances.
Between 1881 and 1914, the OPDA collected roughly one-third of all Ottoman tax revenue and sent it abroad to service the debt. 1 in every 3 coins generated by the economy left the country before the government could spend it. The Sultan reigned, the bankers ruled.
Then Germany entered the picture. Kaiser Wilhelm II visited Istanbul, embraced the Sultan, and portrayed Britain and France as parasites. Germany offered friendship and investment, specifically the Berlin to Baghdad Railway, a steel artery that would connect Europe to the oil fields of the Middle East. The Ottomans accepted, but the terms were just as predatory.
German companies received guaranteed profits per mile of track, regardless of passenger numbers, and full mineral rights over a 20-kilometer corridor on either side of every rail line.
The Sultan had simply traded one set of chains for another.
By 1914, the Ottoman leadership understood the trap they were in. When World War I broke out, they made their gamble. They joined Germany, hoping that a German victory would let them cancel the debts to Britain and France, abolish the OPDA, and reclaim their sovereignty. On the day they declared war, they marched to the OPDA building and expelled the European directors. For one brief moment, they felt free.
The gamble failed. The empire was destroyed.
And yet, even after the empire was gone, the debt survived. When Mustafa Kemal Ataturk founded the Turkish Republic in 1923, European powers returned with their ledgers at the Treaty of Lausanne. "You inherited the land," they said. "You inherit the mortgage." The new republic, devastated and exhausted from war, agreed to pay. For the next 30 years, the young Turkish state sent millions abroad to cover the reckless borrowing of sultans long dead.
The final payment on the Ottoman debt was made on May 25, 1954. 100 years to settle the mistake.
The lesson is carved into that century of payments. The Ottomans believed they could buy modernity with borrowed money. They believed they could purchase the appearance of a great power on credit. What they discovered is that money is never neutral. Every loan is a tether. Every bond is a chain. The British and French never needed to garrison Istanbul. They simply let compound interest do the work.
The sick man of Europe was not defeated in battle. He was foreclosed upon.
And what that story leaves behind is perhaps the most important truth in the entire field of geopolitics. Sovereignty is not just about flags and borders. Sovereignty is about solvency. If you do not own your debt owns you.
If you found this story as gripping as I did, subscribe to the channel. New stories that reshape how you see the world drop regularly, and you will not want to miss what comes next.